I should probably learn from the fact I make my videos a little bit too lengthy. Because frustratingly, I've just uploaded a video. Well, I didn't actually. I got through most of it and then it just conked out. That's frustrating because the subject matter is very important to me. So I'll try and make this quicker. I'll try and get all the points covered soon. Instead of reading out the article this time, I'll just put a link. The subject basically is about torture, and the I newspaper has given a link to a report by Amnesty International, which says that an incredible 36% of Britons think that torture can be justified under some circumstances in order to protect the public. The figures are 25% of Russians, 74% of Chinese, 74%. A few things I want to point out. To make my position clear, I think torture is morally repugnant. I just think it can never be condoned. It's morally repugnant. That does not mean I'm a bleeding heart, doesn't mean I sympathise with terrorists, it just means I recognise A, it's counterproductive, and B, yes, it is immoral. It makes the government just as barbaric as the terrorist organisation. Barbaric. There's a few problems, obvious problems with torture. Leaving aside the morality issue, it's not actually practical because someone being tortured under duress will say anything. And it may well be babble that doesn't make any sense. It may well be that they're so disorientated under so much pain they will say anything. They might not even be aware of what they're saying. So the actual intelligence the torturer would be using or passing on may not be reliable anyway. So they're not actually saving anybody. And the argument about an imminent attack is, I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but that's much less likely than, for example, counterintelligence that stops a terrorist attack happening in the early stages. So the imminent attack scenario is really quite rare. And like I say, the interrogation thing doesn't show that it would actually work anyway, because the person being tortured might just give a different location of the, let's say, the bomb or whatever. So there's that factor to consider. In terms of the percentages, that's truly shocking. I mean, 36% of Britons, that's particularly shocking in a country that does have widespread access to the outside world in terms of media, that education is very high, whereby there is, whilst it's not perfect, the government does not control the media in the same way that you would get in a totalitarian state. So all those factors really makes that 36% quite shocking. China, I'm not so surprised, although I'm still very unsettled by that 74% figure. Although I would say one thing, these sort of percentages are usually from a cross-section of, say, 100 people polled or something. I'm not sure how they managed to do that in a country like China, how they managed to get that information. Definitely would have been anonymous, but anyway, Amnesty International is an organisation I have huge respect for, so I do think their research would have been thorough, they would have done their homework. So these statistics are very unsettling. 25% of Russians, well, does that mean Russians are more compassionate than British and Chinese? I don't think so. I think there must be other factors involved there. And it doesn't mean the Chinese are more cold-blooded than anyone else. I just think there must be other factors involved there in terms of how the question was worded, or I don't know. But it is very unsettling. What I would say is there are other ways to get information from potential terrorists. I mean, I assume this relates directly to the terrorism issue because it's talking about in order to keep the public safe. The problem is many regimes will portray a certain group as terrorists when there's no actual evidence that group has committed violent acts against the civilian population, which would be I think generally people would accept that as a definition of terrorism. In terms of, I'm not talking about state terrorism, I'm talking about radical revolutionary type terrorism. Um, I think most people would agree that's a definition, deliberately targeting civilians. But many governments who portray a group as a terrorist organisation or a threat to stability, they've got very little evidence to show that it actually is. An example would be the brutal persecution of Falun Gong in China. Now, the Chinese government calls them a dangerous cult, but from what I've seen, they've produced very little evidence that they are. I have, however, seen plenty of evidence of the sadistic torture of Falun Gong practitioners. So what I would say is any government that uses terrorism, the burden is on them, uses torture, the burden is on them to prove that it's justified. I don't believe it ever is, but if they're going to try and make a moral high ground, they should show it. And in the case of totalitarian regimes like that in China, they're so dishonest anyway. What's particularly troubling is 155 countries have ratified a treaty, I don't know what year it was, but banning the use of torture, and probably well over half of those countries have violated it. Now, I've mentioned China, but in the report, countries that are particular offenders are Nigeria, Mexico, Philippines. Many of those are either full democracies or quasi-democracies. Uzbekistan, I'm not surprised by. That's a terrible country. There's been reports there of dissidents being boiled alive. But what I find unsettling is that torture is so widespread in the world. I just can't comprehend someone's mindset that they could know what torture is and actually think it's justified, and this is nothing to do with being a bleeding heart. I think terrorists are scum. I think people who deliberately murder civilians are despicable, and I believe they should be punished, for example, by life behind bars. But torture is a certain attack on human dignity that is just repugnant. It is just, regardless of the person being tortured, when a government or agency does that, or terrorist organisation, let's not forget it isn't just governments that do this, it's also insurgent groups and so on. They're equally guilty. And by the way, Amnesty International does condemn them as well when they use torture. Any organisation or individual that uses torture, or government, it should be condemned, because this is just, it is one of the most glaring examples of an attack on basic human dignity, human rights. And it's not that I'm living in an ivory tower and I don't understand some of these situations whereby terrorists are terrorising society. I think there is a need for a war on terrorism, but I believe that those who practice that war on terrorism should not be reducing themselves to the level of the terrorists through these sort of methods. Torture is just repugnant, so is terrorism. But people need to be aware, in many circumstances those being tortured aren't even actual terrorists. I'm not saying that in many circumstances they are members of militant groups and so on, but like I say, in China you have Falun Gong practitioners who are tortured. They're not terrorists. Take my word for it, they're not terrorists. But even Islamist groups, violent Islamist groups, I wouldn't even advocate torture for Boko Haram, and we all know how despicable they are. Torture is just something that's... Now, I can understand human sentiments. If you have lost a family member to terrorism, in cases of child murder, etc., I can fully understand the sentiments behind that. And no doubt there's a human element there whereby I don't doubt if I personally lost someone, I would feel exactly the same way. So I'm not judging people who support it. I suppose I am in a way, but I just think it's very unsettling that so many people think it's okay. Again, there are other ways to get information from militant groups. There are many other methods. I'll leave it there because I want to upload this video, but I'll put a link to that report. It's very unsettling. One last point, Amnesty International is certainly not defending terrorist groups. Like I say, they've condemned them just as forcefully. So, but governments in the end of the day are those who do have the power in most circumstances, and therefore they have the predominant accountability.